Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Questioning Behaviour. My name is Merle, and as always, I am here with the lovely and absolutely amazing Sarah Bowen.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the dummy that don't
The topic of today's episode is financial well-being, so that's a nice immediate spoiler for you there, but then I suppose if you read the title of this episode, you would have figured it out. Sarah, do you think you are financially well?
Oh gosh, I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I like this term, financial well-being. I mean, we spoke to Natalie Spencer a couple of episodes back, sort of on this topic as well, and sort of from her experience as a practitioner in behavioral science. And I think it's amazing. I want to see more of this sort of moving the goalposts for, what we should be aiming for, sort of the key outcomes we should be trying to measure, as to be more a holistic approach. So I'm definitely keen on this movement towards health, right, in terms of and wellness, rather than a sort of are you in the black or are you in the red, right? But I guess both are useful. I mean, how do you sort of look at your own finances? How do you assess whether you are financially healthy as the money expert in the room?
Yeah, sure. How do you judge if you're financially well off? Well, I have savings and I don't have debt, so I think that's pretty bang on. That's for the textbook definition. I'm doing quite well.
Good.
Thinking, yeah, I am looking towards investments. I'm not that rich yet that I've made proper investments. Well, I mean, my dad is more helping me out with that, but me as personally, I haven't gotten there yet. But it's just this, I am keeping an eye on the future. I do have money set aside for, a rainy day, or if something were to break down and stuff like that. Including my washing machine, which is currently broken down. Yeah, exactly.
Uh-oh.
So I'm letting you into my life. But no, I think I'm moving in the right direction. But we are currently talking about, ourselves earning PhD wages. So let's not pretend we are making a lot of money here, especially not the type of money that I think allows you to very much prepare for the future. Obviously, after this, we will hopefully hold much better paying jobs. So we should be better off then.
Don't jinx it. I mean, I'm going to share like a little aside. I was teaching the other day a group of undergrads. Someone in the room sort of was making a comment and sort of saying, as economists, we always end up going into these like high paying jobs, investment banking and stuff. And I was like, yeah, I guess I'm not a very good example of that right now. And everyone just sort of turned and looked at me and was like, oh, poor you, or like laughed in embarrassment. Yeah, it was quite funny. I mean,
that's awful. I'm sorry, buddy.
It's fine. But at the same time, right, me personally, I don't have huge fixed costs right now. So
sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's not too bad. It's enough to survive. It's enough to, buy a tattoo every now and then and piss your parents off. So it's good.
Important stuff. So financially, currently we are sort of well, but if our costs were to suddenly, or if our living costs were to suddenly rise, I think we'd be slightly more in trouble.
Let's not get pregnant anytime soon. Yeah.
No, let's not do
good.
that. Yeah. Okay. Well, on that complete tangent, how about we just dive straight into the interview with our guest? Our guest today is Abby Sussman. Again, if you read the title of this podcast, that's really not a surprise to you. And let's start rambling and let's just dive straight into the interview. Okay, so today we are talking once more, and when I say once more, I mean it's once more for us, but not for you, dear listener, to Abby Sussman. Abby, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing well today. Thanks so much for having me.
Again.
And we can hear you. We can hear you this time, which is even better.
Yes. And hopefully the listener can also hear you. At least that is what we're really, really hoping for. So, Abby, although we have had this rigmarole already, but please, would you introduce yourself to the audience and tell them where your passion for behavioral science comes from?
Who am I? I'm Abby Sussman, so I'm an associate professor of marketing at the University of Chicago at the Business School, Booth School of Business. My research is mainly focused on financial decision making, and it's actually been a bit of a path, a journey to get here. And I think that it has incorporated, I think I've been very fortunate in terms of having, as an undergraduate, been exposed to very small classes in cognitive science. With terrific faculty like Steve Sloman, who really, I think, nurtured me from very early on in terms of being my undergraduate thesis advisor and getting me really excited about research. I also, after college, I worked at Goldman Sachs and in equity research, and I think that experience as well in industry really, I think, cemented my interest specifically in financial decision making as a way of bringing together some of the basic psychology that I was studying as an undergraduate with some of the more applied things that I was learning at Goldman. And so even though essentially, at Goldman, I was pretty exclusively looking at companies, you might say that there sort of aren't that many direct links, but I think that experience was still quite formative in terms of shaping my research interests in actually, I think, just a more applied direction.
All right. So what was the more direct link for you then? Because as you said, we might not be able to see these direct links. And quite frankly, I am grasping a bit, but what was the direct link between your work experience and your educational experience?
Well, I think that there were a couple of things. Maybe it wasn't such a direct link, but I think that there were a couple of things that happened. So I think that one of the things that happened was that while I was at Goldman, I think that I was spending a lot of time thinking about, sort of from purely business side perspective, how would you expect outcomes to materialize, and thinking about how do corporations behave. And I think that actually sparked my interest in thinking about the other side of the equation. So, for example, one of my very first research projects was looking at how people spend on exceptional expenses. This is research that I did with Adam Alter. And the initial impetus for the idea was that in my time at Goldman, working as an equity research analyst for the airline industry, what I learned was that basically airlines had lots of expenses that were not supposed to recur. So, for example, there would be some crazy hurricane that happened one year. There would be some restructuring that happened. They'd have to ground airplanes, whatever it was. There were lots of different one-off types of things that happened. And as a research analyst, what your job is to try to project in the next quarter or in the coming years, what is the run rate going to be for the airline's income and expenses going forward. That's at least one part of the job. And as part of that, you're basically, like, the norm is to strip out these expenses that are supposed to be one time in nature. And the logic behind doing that is that since they're not going to recur, they shouldn't logically influence subsequent predictions for what the future is going to be, or forecasts. And this was something that I thought very much about parallels to individual people and consumers, and how do individuals make decisions about their own finances. And so I can think about a lot of events that I'm happy to categorize as being one-time expenses. So maybe it's my birthday, and so I think I should splurge, or maybe I have friends visiting from out of town, or there's a particular type of technology that I'm particularly excited about purchasing. Whatever it is, in many cases, I think about these types of purchases as being one time. And so the connection there is very much in terms of thinking about, should I be, as a consumer, trying to forecast what my future spending is going to be? Should I be factoring these expenses into my forecasts or not? And what are the consequences in either direction? And so what we find in that paper is, first off, that people are better at forecasting sort of ordinary recurring expenses than they are at these more exceptional or one-time expenses. People tend to overspend on exceptional versus ordinary expenses in relative terms. And that one of the underlying reasons for this, I think there may very well be motivational factors at play, but that's actually not the main thing that we're looking at. What we're looking at in the paper is really from a categorization perspective, people just don't think about these expenses as mattering. So you can think about from a pennies a day perspective, if expenses are really small. So if you buy a cup of coffee, you might think, this doesn't influence my diet because this doesn't influence my budget because it's such a small expense. I can just round it down to zero. In the context of exceptional expenses, it could be something large. It could be something that you could predict. So these don't have to be sort of surprises at all. But you think, well, since this is only happening one time, it's not going to recur. Therefore, I don't need to think about it in terms of my budget. And so there was a pretty direct parallel in that context between businesses and people.
Yeah, that is a very direct link. I can see. So what you're telling me is that airlines are very much like people.
Exactly.
Just absolutely terrible at estimating what's actually going to happen in a year. Yeah, so I guess the hurricane equivalent for an airline is like the washing machine breaking down for a person.
Exactly.
And then realizing that you didn't actually have any savings left to replace that washing machine because you bought 20 pairs of shoes in the past year.
Yeah, exactly.
That's quite autobiographical.
It's very autobiographical. I'm currently looking at my broken washing machine. So yes, it is very autobiographical.
I find that so interesting, Abby. I mean, and I want to probe into your research and your research interest, but it strikes me. So was that one of the main motivating reasons for you to move out of the applied space back into a research space? This idea that you want to focus more on the individual in terms of as a decision maker rather than the firm? Why not, change the applied career and work somewhere else? Like what was it that drew you back into academic research?
For me, I think I had a great experience working at Goldman, and I think I learned a ton and got a very different perspective than you do staying in academia the whole way through. But I was just more interested in the work that I had done as an undergraduate. So I think, a couple of years out of college, I was doing some serious soul searching to try to think about, what is my destiny? What am I really meant to be doing with my life? And, is it to stay and have a career in finance, or is it potentially to do something else that I might enjoy more? And for me, I really took that time to think back to my experiences as an undergrad and to think about how much I valued those experiences. And so that was what I turned to.
I was going to say, most people in their mid-20s, they go to Thailand to find themselves, but you went to Goldman Sachs.
So I want to actually take you back a bit to a previous answer you just gave, Abby, because you had a very interesting slip of the tongue where you said diet instead of budget when we were talking about, just adding a coffee or just a random coffee onto your expenditure, your list of expenditure, if you will. And it wouldn't matter because it's a one-off. But you said diet instead of budget. So within the behavioral science that we know of health, given that people very often undercount how much they consume and they kind of seem to forget how much they have consumed, and then they are baffled that they're not losing weight, is personal finance very similar to that? Is there a lot of overlap between these two subfields?
I believe there is. So I think that these are two fields that I think are examined very much in isolation. But there are so many similarities. You're basically budgeting scarce resources. And so in the context of finances, you think about having a limited amount of money that you're trying to spread throughout the month. In the context of dieting, I think you have people who have scarce caloric resources, which is a problem that I'm not considering it in this particular context.
Sure.
But you can also think about somebody who essentially is trying to maintain their weight or trying to lose weight. And for this person, they have essentially a budget of calories that they can spend each day on the food that they're consuming. And so this is something that I've given a lot of thought to, and I think that there really should be more discussion between sort of researchers looking at financial decisions and researchers looking at some of these either time allocation decisions or weight loss allocation decisions. And I have a project currently also with Adam Alter and with Anna Paley, which is looking at an extension of this idea of exceptional calories in a food context. And so we find actually that there are very similar types of patterns that play out there as well. And so people tend to think that foods that they eat infrequently do not have as large of an impact on their diet as foods that they eat frequently. And so it actually, that was a very nice segue. So thank you.
You're very welcome. No, so
amazing.
it's great because I always had this feeling that there was quite an overlap, because what you're looking at essentially, if you look, for example, at the fact that people undersave for their pension and they tend to overeat and then are surprised that their diet hasn't worked, I thought it would be quite a similar type of process going on, but I thought I might as well ask an expert. So what exactly is going on there? Is this a form of present bias, or... Because if you just continuously underestimate, the Big Mac you eat irregularly, which definitely has absolutely no nutritional value and a lot of calories, plus the fact that, a washing machine does ever so often break down and needs replacing, does this have something to do with discounting? Is this a temporal thing? Is this present bias? Like, where are we supposed to look for the mechanism behind this?
So you're still talking about exceptional calories or exceptional items, or more generally sort of
I have a feeling that let's stay specific first and then move more general later.
Yeah, so I mean, the way that we think about it is not so much about present bias. It in many cases is a categorization issue. And so if I, let's say, go to buy Halloween candy, I could think about this as part of my grocery budget. Now, if I did that, I would increase the amount of my grocery budget for that week by $20 or $50 or however much you spend on Halloween candy. And that then I would sort of have a place to record this expense. And for the next week, I would say, okay, well, last week I spent $20 more than I usually do. Next week, I think I will also spend $20 more than I usually do, let's say. And if you consistently saw that pattern, then you would just permanently adjust your budget by $20. Now, what ends up happening from a categorization perspective is, let's say, something like Halloween candy. You're more likely to take this Halloween candy and say, this is not part of my grocery budget. It is not part of my holiday budget. I don't have a one-off expenses budget. And therefore, I don't have, there's no place for me to put this expense. And so why should I be considering this going forward? From just a pure forecasting perspective, there's no value in me forecasting this going forward, because I know that next month or next week, I am not going to be buying Halloween candy. And you're right that you're not going to be buying Halloween candy. The point is that you might be purchasing something else, right? So next you might be buying cakes for your family coming over for Christmas or Thanksgiving or any sort of whatever else it is. People tend not to have a single category for one-off expenses.
No, I actually just thought about it because you mentioned Thanksgiving and Christmas. And if you look, so Thanksgiving is obviously a very, very American thing. But if I were to look at like seasonal things in America, in October you have Halloween, November has Thanksgiving, Christmas obviously happens in December. I mean, Sarah was jumping to July. I was planning on going through the whole year, month by month. But
Sorry.
No, that's all right. So, someone is clearly impatient. But the idea is that if you think about it quite logically, you can come up with a type of expense that fits the bill for almost each of these months. So after a while, it's probably a good idea to have this is just an accidental expense that happened that happens every month, but we don't adjust.
And that's just thinking about holidays, right? You're not even going beyond holidays. So yeah, I agree with you. I think that would be something that would be very valuable to do, and that's something that we would want to test empirically going forward, is sort of what is the value of having a specific category, either for something like holidays or for something like, just sort of one-off expenses. And And so we can think about, in the original paper with Adam, we have a study where we basically remind people of other times when we get people to think about spending money on a birthday present, and we remind people in one of the conditions of other times when they've spent money on birthday presents.
Sure.
And we find that essentially this manipulation versus a few different controls leads people to spend less. And so the idea is that even when you take something that people should be able to predict, right? This isn't your washing machine breaking down. This is something that should be totally predictable. Like, you should be aware of how many times during the year how many people you buy birthday presents for. But even in this context, people still tend not to think about this as sort of a single category. People tend to treat them each as an isolated incident.
Oh, interesting. So is this something that then can be fixed by just like showing people like a calendar, or say, for example, the month October, or, you know, pick a random month, and just going through it without, you know, a financial nudge, if you will, without a financial prime or any type of indication that they have to think about this from a financial perspective, and just ask people, what do you think is going to happen in this month? And that they indicate, oh yeah, it's my mom's birthday, and in the second week, I don't know, my kid has a school trip, which you definitely have to pay for. And then, and at the end of the month, oh yeah, it's also Halloween. Is that type of just sitting down and figuring out what's going to happen in a non-financial context, would that be enough to trigger a mental account for these expenses, do you think?
So probably not. So in the study that I just described, we have basically 3 conditions. So we have just sort of like a control condition, think about some random thing. We have a birthday present financial condition, which is think about times when you've bought people birthday presents specifically, so sort of priming spending on birthdays. And then we just have a list of birthdays of people that you know during the course of the year. And we find that just having people think about these birthdays in and of itself does not lead to the same effect.
Okay, so you need to,
in terms of
you really need to talk about money specifically.
Yeah, I think this is not something, I mean, I think it's very intuitive to just think about these as all separate events.
So is this a mental accounting issue then?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's categorization. So I think of categorization and mental accounting, categorization of money and mental accounting as being similar or the same.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or one is a subset of the other.
Yeah. And I mean, with this, you know, a system of mental accounting where, you know, people have these pots of money we can sort of imagine in their head. I mean, I pretty much can only operate with 3 personally. Rent, bills, everything else.
Oh,
right?
Sarah!
Okay, yeah, so maybe I'm like, you know, patient 101 in this case, right? But, you know, so is it a case that we need to sort of rethink that system? I mean, intuitively, I think if I was to keep adding more categories, right, I guess that's probably one of the problems with just having categories, is that you always miss something out, right? So if I start thinking about seasonal holidays, okay, I might be sorted there, but I'm not taking into account birthdays. I'm not taking into account household appliances getting broken down. Like, how finely do I need to categorize expenses? And at a certain point, I mean, the system that's supposed to make things simpler for me has become too complicated for me to keep track of. That's why I stick with 3.
For sure, right. So I think mental accounts serve different purposes. So one of the things that's useful about mental accounts is it just simplifies the decision when you go to the store and you're thinking about, you know, how much can I spend on groceries or how much can I spend on a tube of toothpaste? You can think about buying that tube of toothpaste as part of your grocery budget. And it gives you a sense of, you know, how much can I spend this month? Maybe I can stock up for the next few months because I have extra money in my grocery budget right now.
Yep.
And that is in comparison to saying, well, how much can I spend on toothpaste this month? Let me think about all of the money that I have available everywhere in current and future income, you know, in investment income. Let me think about everything before I decide how much money I have to spend. And so from that perspective, mental accounting can be very helpful in terms of just helping people think about budgeting at all. We can also think about mental accounting being helpful from a self-control perspective. So you can say, I can only spend X amount on this particular on this particular type of product. And once that money has run out, I'm done. So, I have money to spend on restaurants and I have money to spend on other forms of entertainment. And by essentially creating these two categories, you can think about a situation where, well, if I'm done with my restaurant account and I want to go to a restaurant, even if I have money in my entertainment account, something that very clearly falls into my restaurant account is something that I won't spend money on.
Right.
And so that could leave you at the end of the month with extra money in your entertainment account, which might be actually useful from a savings perspective, as well as just making sure that you're not overspending on your restaurant account. So I think it can be helpful from that perspective. In terms of thinking about the optimal number of accounts, I don't think that we have strong evidence on what the optimal number of accounts is. The point that I think is important is that all expenses are included. So you could think about having actually 3 accounts of a rent, bills, and everything else that could be very effective if you're right. You could imagine an everything else plus maybe a savings account for something that you might want to not spend all of the money in the everything else account, or maybe you do. But I think that would be one approach that would still be separating your money into different accounts, and that would still be, in some sense, it's a discretionary spending account is sort of what you have left over. And so I think that works. And in particular, if you're marking down all of your expenses and putting them all into the discretionary spending account, that might be totally fine. Like, that might be the best thing for you.
Yeah. Okay. So, is this an example of a scenario where actually taking this decision out of people's heads is better, like putting it in sort of like more like a technological app? So maybe a spending app that sort of syncs to your calendar, right? If you ask some questions in the app, which sort of says, how much do you spend on average on a birthday, right? And then it can see when these birthdays are coming up in your calendar and sort of help, take that decision or take that budgeting, out of the hands of the individual. Is that something that is feasible? In your opinion, is that something that would be helpful in this space? Does that help solve the problem?
I guess, going back to your earlier point, which is you can think about birthdays, you can think about family visiting from out of town, you can think about, the top 100 most common things that are irregular expenses. But I think that in terms of thinking about sort of what an app could do, like you could have an app that, has a greater ability than a human being to keep track of all of these potentially one-off sorts of expenses and what categories they might fall into. I think that there will inevitably be some things that are not included in that. And so I think that, the suggestion for what would be most likely to be better would be just tracking, period. So having an app that, can identify this has been what your spending has been for the last few years, and this is what we should predict it will be, including seasonal trends and whatever else, saying just taking this into account, this is what we predict that your spending will be. So I do think sort of taking some of the low-level categorization out of it, or you could have an app that categorizes it however they want, but basically doing it, making sure that all of the money that you spend is included.
Right. You're studying, the common errors that we shouldn't be making, but that we keep making in terms of financial decision making. Is the answer to a lot of these questions technology needs to improve because humans are sort of limited in their cognitive capacity?
I can think of things. I can think of some things for sure that have not helped people manage their money better, and that haven't helped them at all spending less specifically. Without being done for libel, I'm pretty sure I can state that Amazon's one-click buy system isn't helping anyone save money.
Yeah, so I think that there are 2 different routes that can take. So one is just that an app doesn't work if you don't use it effectively. So like you can have Mint and, upload half of your accounts to Mint, and then it's essentially useless. I think your point is that technology can also help facilitate spending. And that's completely true. And so I think that this gets to existing research on pain of paying and other sorts of channel factors, right? So pain of paying is sort of a friction that's created. Then you can think about channel factors where you can have just sort of simplifying the process and making it easier. It's one-click buy, but it's also subscribe and save. I think falls into the same category where, let's say you have a 15% discount through Subscribe and Save, and you say, okay, I'll just buy this through Subscribe and Save and I'll cancel it, before the next month comes up or whatever, and I'd order again. And then all of a sudden it shows up at your door and now you have to return it. And so all of a sudden you've purchased, 3 times as much of whatever the product is than you had initially intended. So I think technology can certainly facilitate spending as well.
Yeah. I fear the consequences of when these shoe stores have these like one-click buy buttons for Merle's sake. Your flat is not big enough to house all those shoes that you would buy.
My apartment isn't big enough, and I feel like once my shoe collection outgrows my apartment, that is a pretty clear indicator that I should stop. I think then by that case,
only then
I will quit. Well, I guess I'll stop buying shoes once my actual well-being goes to shit and my apartment overflows probably as a result, but also as a direct cause of that. So that's a very, very unsmooth segue for me to ask Abby a bit more about her research on financial well-being. So, Abby, from your expert opinion, what really changes someone's financial well-being? Like, what has to happen for you to just be financially incredibly unwell, I suppose?
Well, I mean, look, I think that there are big structural factors. I think there are things like employment, income opportunities, education. I think that there are very large structural factors, health expenses that behavioral scientists, frankly, don't have that much to say about. And then I think that there are other avenues where behavioral scientists can have a lot to say. And so you can think about, even on the sort of education and income front, thinking about things like helping people fill out financial aid applications, and other sorts of ways of sort of facilitating both education and employment opportunities. So I think that behavioral scientists can be helpful with that. I think those are things that could be incredibly helpful in terms of people's overall well-being, from a specifically financial well-being. But you can also think about a host of other cases where people are leaving money on the table that they shouldn't be. And these are cases where you can imagine somebody who is taking out credit card debt and not repaying it effectively, for example. So you can end up paying a lot of money, especially when you don't have a lot of slack, through credit card expenses or payday loans, where basically you're paying a lot of money that you don't necessarily have in ways that are essentially just inefficient. So if you made pretty small changes to the way that you allocated your spending or repaid different sorts of debt, you might be able to save a substantial amount of money. And these are places where I think actually I think that you can have a lot to contribute in terms of helping people who might be okay if they basically make all of their decisions as effectively as they can, sort of as cost efficiently as they can. Whereas if you're living sort of on a thin margin, that's not money that you can afford to waste. So, for example, in some of my research, I'm looking at different strategies that people use in terms of allocating money to debt across different credit cards. And this is research that I've been doing with Sam Hirschman, who's now a postdoc at UC Boulder. Or you can think about an existing puzzle, which is this co-holding puzzle, which has been identified in the economics literature, where people are simultaneously borrowing money on credit cards, let's say, at 15% interest, and saving money in a savings account that's earning close to zero interest. And so you can think about behaviors like this, and I think behavioral scientists could have a lot to say about what can you do to basically help consumers with these sorts of problems. So I think that the co-holding puzzle, in my mind, is sort of an interesting case where economists have done, I think, a very good job of documenting this pattern and how it exists in the world, and proposing various sort of rational explanations for why people might be engaging in this. But I think that there's a lot of room for behavioral scientists to come in and with a better understanding of consumer behavior, really contribute to the conversation in terms of proposing solutions and additional explanations for what might be.
Well, I obviously to a large extent know that a lot of the behavioral finance, and then I don't mean macro, but I mean micro finance, is focusing on credit card and credit card debt. So after a while, especially if you like read this literature a bit too often, or you read just paper after paper after paper about credit cards and how they're the devil, after a while you have to ask yourself, are credit cards actually good for people? Do they make sense to have?
I mean, different people have credit cards for different reasons. So you can think about sort of a credit card versus a debit card. If you're thinking about just transacting through a credit card, I think that that's a very helpful way of buying things through Amazon on one click, which you wouldn't be able to do without your credit card or potentially a debit card in its place. You can also think about credit cards being really important from the perspective of giving people access to credit that they might not otherwise have. So let's say that your car breaks down and you don't have any money in your bank and you need to get it fixed. Well, a credit card allows you to borrow. So I think it's a dangerous product in the sense that people certainly can spend more than they otherwise would because they have this excess liquidity and then find out that it's costly. But I think in many cases, I think in many cases it provides people with liquidity that they really need. So I wouldn't recommend just sort of, closing all banks that offer credit cards and having that be the end of it. I think that there really are better ways to interact with credit products.
So I'm interested, do you have sort of a hypothesis, or maybe there are sort of possible explanations floating around in sort of the behavioral science space of why people are making these inefficient choices leading to these opportunity costs? What are the sort of the decision rules that people are using that lead us to these sort of paradoxes?
Yeah, so I think that it depends on what the particular behavior is that people are doing ineffectively. But I think often, I think that there are sort of two different pieces of it. I think one is a lack of attention or lack of ability. And this is just, we have limited processing power and limited time. And we don't necessarily want to be spending all of our time thinking about the most efficient way to allocate our resources. Right? So I think in some cases, there's just, bounded rationality, bounded attention, bounded motivation. So I think that plays some role. I think technology could be very helpful in those cases. You can also think about a different situation where maybe you're totally aware of what the most cost-effective way is of doing something, but you don't want to do it that way because you're willing to pay for some other reason. So for example, in the case of co-holding, in research that I've done with Rourke O'Brien, one of the explanations that we look at there is the idea that people want to preserve savings for basically for goals that they consider to be responsible. So if you are thinking about saving money, let's say for your child's education, for your own education, for your retirement account, these might be long-term needs. You might be totally aware of the fact that spending money from spending money on a credit card in order to keep money in these accounts is costly, and you might realize that actually you could put the money back in well before you're going to need the money for those reasons, or that you could. But if it's just really important to you to be certain that you will have money for these purposes that are important to you, you might say, look, I'm willing to pay 15% interest on my credit card to make sure, and here you're essentially paying for a self-control device, to make sure that the money will be available for me in the specific account that I want whenever I'm ready for it. And so I think often, in many of the cases, I think, I think somebody studying these sorts of questions, I think you always are asked by readers or audience members or whoever is thinking about this research, is this normative or is this rational? And I think often what I'm looking at, I will very rarely take a stance on whether behavior is rational or not. I think that the question in many cases is sort of trying to think through what is the underlying psychology on the one hand, and also is it costly? So, is it rational to be paying money to preserve money in savings? Well, I think that's sort of, maybe that aligns with people's preferences. And so I think that from my perspective, a real consideration is that it's costly. And so are there ways that you could potentially help with this? So in that particular paper, what we find is that if you basically give people a scenario where you tell them, look, you have an emergency and it's going to cost you $1,000 to deal with this emergency. Would you take money out of this account, let's say, that you're saving for your education, or would you borrow on a credit card? And people say that they would be more likely to borrow on a credit card versus if it's not for something that's so important to them. So if rather than saving for their education, if they're saving for a vacation, then they say, like, sure, I'll take the money from my vacation account. But if you then say, look, we're going to take the $1,000 from your savings account, either for something that you think of as being really sort of a responsive goal, something like saving for education, or from something that you consider to be more frivolous, like saving for a vacation. And we're going to automatically deduct $100 from your paycheck each month and put it back into your savings account that you had originally intended. So basically what this lets people do is it lets them say, look, the thing that I really cared about was making sure that I had money in this account when I need it. I don't think I'm going to be using this money in the next year, so that's fine. And now that you've given me this alternative mechanism to replace the money, now I'm fine with that. And so this basically reduces it. So I think that, if you can understand and identify cases where people are making costly decisions and understand why they're doing this, then potentially you could think of alternatives that essentially stop people from making these costly decisions while still essentially preserving the psychological benefits that were previously associated with those costs. And so I think that for me is a goal in much of my research.
Super interesting. This focus on financial well-being and sort of financial wellness, and sort of trying to figure out, what alternative solutions can we offer people that will be attractive, right? That won't be violating these sort of psychological mechanisms. Is that sort of the future of actually enacting sort of a financial well-being approach to sort of these interventions? Is that sort of where you see things going?
I think that it really has to do with understanding what the underlying cause is for various inefficiencies. And so in this particular case, I think that that's something that works. In other contexts, you might imagine something else mattering. So maybe, to the earlier point about bounded rationality or bounded attention or motivation, I think in all of those cases, you could think about technology providing a perfectly good solution. Sort of in the absence of a more creative solution, it's basically just reducing frictions that make it hard to repay. So, for example, like an alternative is the case where you think about somebody who just has 6 different credit cards, and they have, let's say, none of them have rewards points or anything like that, but they have variation in their the interest rates. So having that, there's no particular desire to pay money towards the lower interest rate card first, but there might be reasons that people end up doing it that are just not, for example, people might feel like once they're paying money to pay the minimum, that they should put additional money towards that account. So I have research with Sam Hirschman that I mentioned earlier that's looking at this, basically sort of what's the effect of needing to pay the minimum in each account towards allocating money inefficiently across these multiple credit card accounts. Now, that's something that, you could ask people and they might say, well, I don't really think it's right to just pay the minimum. I'd rather pay a little bit more than the minimum once I go in and to pay that. So, but I don't think that would be a deeply held belief. That's not sort of a conviction belief. That's if this were just automated for me and somebody just told me that they had an app that was going to do this in the most efficient way possible, I would be fine with that. Okay. And so I think that a lot of these frictions that technology can really deal with independent of the consumer, once the consumer sort of latches onto it. And I think that, another danger of technology is that you have to make sure that the interests and incentives of the platform align with the consumer. And so I think that that's something that's important to look out for whenever you're thinking about any sort of technology. Is sort of, what is the technology? Why are they in this, and what are they getting out of this? But I think sort of assuming purely altruistic motives, from the technology platform, I think that's something that can be done really well.
Yeah, very, very wise words.
So I'm then quite curious, Abby, because you said, given that, an app had an effective way of going about managing your money and was doing so altruistically, or at least, what is that saying? With your best
interests?
Yes, that was the word. It starts with an I. With your best interest at heart, you'd be quite happy to give up that type of control. So then I'm quite curious, because it's the general joke that everyone who studies psychology went to do so because they're psychologically fucked up, right? So did you start doing financial well-being? That's a general saying. No, that's a general joke. Okay.
So Dutch. So Dutch.
I think it's me search, I think is the expression.
Is it me search?
You study what you're bad at.
So did you go into financial well-being because you're actually quite bad at managing money, or used to be quite bad at dealing with money?
I think it's interesting on the sort of technology and automation front. Like, I think there are many things that I could relinquish to technology that I think would probably help me that I have really very little interest in doing. And so I think for sure thinking about my own sort of quirks, or things that I think of as my own quirks in terms of how I think about my finances, and then to wonder if, are these quirks shared broadly? I think that certainly has been a motivation in my own research, for sure. So yes, also me search.
Lots of me search.
Yeah, we're all victims of me search.
Absolutely. Sure. That's 100% the reason I went into behavioral science. I'll admit to that. My focus on personal finance and how people handle money comes from my own way of maybe not always handling money that well. Some choices weren't that ideal. Just ask my massive shoe rack. So Abby, where do you see yourself going? Where do you see your research developing into? Are you going to stay in financial well-being for a prolonged period of time? Are there any other topics that have captured your interest?
Yeah, so I mean, I think in my mind, I think financial well-being is going to be the core. I think that one of the places that this has led me is also to thinking about research in terms of sustainable investing. And so thinking more sort of on the behavioral finance side there. And so I have some research with Sam Hartzmark that looks at essentially how the launch of Morningstar sustainability ratings led to increased fund flows towards sort of more sustainably labeled funds. And I do think that I have an interest broadly, not only in consumer financial well-being, but also in consumer well-being. And so I do think that a future direction for me of interest really is in understanding both sort of sustainable investing and also how people are thinking about sustainability from a consumer product perspective more broadly. So I think that at my core, I think that the financial decision making remains at the core. I think that's really where most of my interests lie. But I think that both in terms of where the conversation started around, are financial decisions unique, or do they share some properties from allocating other types of resources like time or money? So I think that certainly is part of the extension. And on the flip side of that, not really the flip side, but also would be thinking about sustainability and more sort of ethical business practices. I think that partly comes from, I've increasingly been partnering with banks, and often people will say, why would the bank run an experiment with you to try to help their consumers? Like, aren't banks all evil? And so fortunately, that seems like that's not entirely true. And I've had very good experiences, at least with parts of banks that are very interested in promoting their consumers' well-being, their clients' well-being. And I think that, they may have various motives for doing that, but, I think to the earlier point about technology, as long as incentives are aligned, then it's great. And so I think that makes me think much more about sort of ethical business practices, and that brings you to sort of corporate social responsibility and sustainability. So I think that all pretty much comes together.
Yeah, I mean, this conversation gives me so much hope. I mean, we've talked about the fact that there's still so much research to be done, so many questions to answer. It's super exciting. The fact that there are some real, tangible, good ideas for how to help people improve their financial decision making, and the fact that banks aren't evil. So all good news today. So
Yes.
Thanks for that.
And on that super positive note, Abby, our last question to our interviewees is always, is there anything you'd like to plug? Is there anywhere, if people want to keep up to date with you and your work, where should they be looking online? What is it that you really would want people to know, essentially?
I think that question is too hard to end with. So Marilla started by saying that this is my second time doing it. So the last time that I did this, I just directed you towards my website on Booth. I also have Twitter. I'm A Sussman, I think, at Twitter. Something like that. Abby Sussman.
Don't worry, we'll link it. Don't worry, Abby. We will hunt you down on the social media ourselves. You are terrible at plugging anything. Is there not like a book you'd still want to sell or anything we can do for you?
One day I'll write my book and then I'll come back to plug it.
Yes,
okay,
excellent.
there we go.
That's the promise. Yeah,
exactly. Then we can talk more about financial well-being, consumer well-being, and some more sustainable business practices. That sounds good. So yeah, you're on. Pinky promise. You're on.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much
for coming, Abby.
Yes, again, Abby. Thank you so much.
All right, so that was us talking to the absolutely amazing Abby Sussman. So I've learned a lot. Topic of financial well-being is something I find fascinating all day, every day. So it was really cup of my kind of tea. Sarah, I know you're predominantly in health or behavioral change currently. So what did you think? Are you trying now? Are you thinking of restructuring your entire mental accounting approach?
To be honest, yeah, maybe. I don't know. I think these 3 pots of money in my mind, it has served me pretty well so far. I mean, I think what I would need is someone to present me with an alternative that's going to be good for me without sort of messing up my psychological ordering system. And yeah, that seems attractive to me. I mean, I have to say, I really enjoyed our conversation with Abby. I think I don't like to play favorites, but it probably was one of my favorite conversations. And I don't know.
You heard
why.
it here first, folks.
Well, I do know why. I mean, so Abby, we actually spoke with Abby for a full hour previously, and it has been lost in the ether somewhere. So it was a really good conversation, and I find it so fascinating that we can know something about ourselves. We can know that we're really bad at, for example, trying to predict these, irregular expenses, but it's not an easy problem to solve. We know that it's a problem. We know that it's something that affects not just individuals, but airlines, right? So it feels like, and I think in our conversation, you also sort of drew these comparisons to other types of behavior. So like diet and Big Macs were spoken about, unexpected calories and stuff. So it's something that we have these interesting psychological mechanisms and there's research on it, but how to solve it, it's still such an open question. So yeah, super interesting.
Yeah.
What about you?
Like you said. No, it's just like you said. It's really, really cool stuff. I like the fact that it works for health or diet at least, as well as it works or actually doesn't work for personal finance. So it's very interesting that this categorization issue or mental accounting issue, if you will, is so far spread throughout different domains of our lives. So I think I'm looking forward to the research that's going to come out. Studying categorization specifically in whatever field, so whether it's personal finance or health decision making. So yeah, I'm looking forward. I thought it was a great conversation. I am now going to budget the rest of this year and
nice.
maybe set myself a goal of buying slightly less shoes. Slightly.
I don't know. Do they bring you joy? Do they spark joy? Those shoes?
They always spark joy. Of course, my shoes spark me joy.
No, it's so interesting, and I think the role of technology is going to be super, super key here. But yeah, I mean, I've been thinking a lot more, I think, about the way that I think about money, which, I mean, even though sort of, you're in the world of behavioral science, you talk to people who sort of make you, think about yourself and do a bit of me search and a bit of introspection. Yeah, it's one of those things where I'm starting to question whether or not the way I think about money, for me, it's effective because I don't have to spend a lot of energy thinking about it. It's a very simple system that I have that, I mean, so far I haven't gone bankrupt, but there's still
Good.
time. But yeah, I think it's one of those things where sometimes it takes someone else to take a look at what you're doing to sort of see where there are some big mistakes, big human type mistakes going on. So yeah, maybe you need to look at my finances and I need to look at your finances. How
you can look at my shoes if you want to.
Yeah. No, that's part of my research into your finances.
Clearly. Anyway, I think we're drifting slightly on a tangent here. Guys, I hope you really enjoyed the episode. As always, thanks so much to our lovely interviewee, in this case, Abby Sussman, for making the time. Abby, we will probably very likely talk to you soon. At least we hope so, because we had a great time. Guys, our dear listeners, please let us know on social media what you thought of the episode, if you thought it was thought-provoking, educational, or at least entertaining. And as always, we hope you have a great week, and we hope to see you next week.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the one